Welcome everybody to this landmark Chambers and Pinsent Masons webinar on planning for the future, the government's white paper on planning reform. You're most welcome, thank you for attending. We've got between us a lot of work to do, not just in the next hour and a half, but in the next months and potentially years ahead when dealing with the proposed set of reforms we've got. But as a starter, we hope that today's event will help you. First of all, understand some things about the paper that you haven't yet had a chance to reach, and also with some early thoughts and provisional thoughts about the direction of travel that we're heading in. For those of you who don't know, my name is Rupert Warren, QC. I'm chair for today, and I'll introduce our other speakers in a moment, but let me deal with just a few very short matters of housekeeping before we go any further. You are all muted, as you probably realise. There is a question and answer button. We very much welcome questions throughout the event, and we'll try to pick up as many as we can at the end. The format for today is that there'll be 4 presentations, and at the end of each one we're going to have 5 minutes or so of discussion where we may pick up any questions that have come through during that paper. There'll then be a question and answer session, a discussion between the panel members at the end of about 25 minutes, where again we hope to have picked up some of the points that you may have raised during the event. The event's recorded. You'll all get a link to the recording with the email that comes out afterwards. If you lose the connection or you have to go and do something else and want to rejoin, just use the original link that you've used a few minutes ago to join us. There won't be any form of paper being produced afterwards, but obviously the issues that are raised are to be approached mainly by sectors, by stakeholder interests and so on. And so we're very interested, both those of us at Landmark and those at Pinsent Masons, in understanding what further more specific workshops and webinars you might find helpful in the next period, due through to the end of the consultation period, maybe in September, early October. One short point about the screen: you can change the view that you have of the screen by clicking view options in the bar at the top, and then you can move it around, or when I'm on, potentially obscure the ghastly view itself and just focus on the paper. So I think with that, let me introduce the speakers. In all clockwise order, starting on the left-hand side at the top, I'm Rupert Warren, as I've said. I'm a planning specialist working across all of the sectors that we all work in. For my sins, I've had experience with the government in drafting the 2012 and the 2018 NPPFs, and also advised recently on the changes to the Use Classes Order and the GPDO. I'll be followed, my paper about local plans and decisions, by Zach Simons of Landmark Chambers. He is the country's top-rated planning junior as far as the 2020 Planning Magazine survey was concerned. He acts across all sectors in UK planning, particularly for house builders, promoters, for local government and central government. And he will be focusing on one of our sectors, on housing specifically today. He will be followed by Jan Bessel, who will be well known, I'm sure, to lots of you. She is now a strategic planning advisor specialising at Pinsent Masons in major development and infrastructure, on negotiating through development plan processes and all of the difficulties and complexities of the current system of EIA, SA, SEA, and so on. She has been, as you know, a commissioner at the Infrastructure Planning Commission and an examining inspector. So her insight, particularly on the plan making and the DCO aspects of this, is a unique one and I hope valuable. And then last but by no means least, Richard Ford, partner at Pinsent Masons. He is a specialist in major planning, CPO, housing, and across all of infrastructure, not just in the UK, but with a global reach, and has experience of working on the design of new planning strategies and planning systems. And his insight will, I hope, be valuable for that reason, as well as his general experience negotiating through major developments for clients across the country. That's the order that we will be speaking in. he'll be dealing in particular with the infrastructure levy and the abolition of 106 and so on. So, as I say, the aims of today are dictated partly by where we are in time, and I hope helpfully are pitched, are calibrated at a particular level, a degree of explanation, but most of you, I suspect, will have read the document a number of times already, so not too much of that. Mainly the drawing out of issues, consequences of those points, certain uncertainties, opportunities, and risks, because it's potentially a fundamental reform of a system which is hugely complicated and multifaceted. And also it's a system with lots, as it were, of ghosts in the machine. There's the market, local democracy, people's sense of identity. There's a huge amount at stake when making any large-scale change to the planning system. We're not going to deal, other than housing, for obvious reasons, given the slant of the white paper, with any other sectoral or issue-specific analysis today. That's really, as I've said, for a later date. We're going to be touching, I think, on what the positioning of these reforms are, what the government wishes to show. Will it's faster? Will it deliver more? Is it simpler? Will it achieve those things without the risk being manifest to assets which are cherished? Are we going to end up with a reform which is comprehensive? Are we going to have something, despite the headlines, which is more piecemeal? And so perhaps a piece on how this fits into the entire system will emerge from some of the points that we talk about today. But really, we're aiming to explore some of the critical things that will lead to your consultation responses, yours or those of your clients. The points that affect the national level, which is, as we'll come to, hugely important when we're considering how this new system looks like it's intended to work. For instance, the setting of the housing numbers, the recasting of the big ticket delivery agenda issues, what happens to the local control over those aspects, large sites, small sites, and that local power, how will it be exercised? Where will it find its path in the new system, so that locals feel and actually have a voice? And then initial thoughts, obviously, on the opportunities and risks that some of these major strokes give rise to. And some, at this stage of the wider issues, will, for instance, this system retrieve the dire situation that we're told we're in terms of the trust that the public has in the planning system, in local planning authorities and so on, the trust in the system of all major stakeholders, a critical issue that I'm sure we'll be touching on to some degree. So with that introduction, I shall carry on, because I'm giving the first of these papers today. And I'm going to be focusing on local plans, decisions, and the shape of the system, so something of an overarching paper before we dive into the other topics. I won't summarise for you what's in proposals 1 to 5, 8 to 9, and 16. Those are the proposals within mainly Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 that I'm looking at. I'll just touch very briefly on some of the headline points before looking at what they may mean. Plainly, changes of this kind are going to require primary and secondary legislation. They're going to require sweeping away the existing set of provisions within the 2004 Act, for instance, and materially changing a number of others. They're going to require some major surgery to the NPPF, I suspect, and who knows, our friend the PPG no doubt will also follow. At the preliminary stage is the national level. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this in a minute. The housing numbers distribution and constraints exercise that we gather will take place right at the outset. There'll be a single sustainability test, which I know Jan is going to touch on in her paper. What in fact does that mean? We're told it's straightforward. Is it straightforward? How's it going to be defined, and how's that going to work? Then we have the tripartite division of all land in local plans into growth, renewal and protected areas. And that process, how will that be decided? How much detail will go into that? How to deliver the detailed stage, which then follows the growth stage. Reserve matters, LDO, even we're told a DCA process, and how do those articulate? And the decision-making processes here, of course, are tied into the plan even more closely, indeed automatically in some cases, than they have been before. Development management policies are to be removed, we're said, and kept at a policy level in the NPPF, but parallel in the local plan process, more design coding, pattern book or neighbourhood plan-based design work will fill in the local tier, if you like, of that work. And so the new system may become a route to an outline planning permission through the plan, but otherwise it seems section 38.6 will survive perhaps in an amended form. I want to touch then first on this national level and ask some questions that I think we're all going to have to grapple with in our consultation responses. Zach's going to deal with the housing numbers point, but obviously this is an exercise which will take place at Marsham Street. There is a national political agenda, which is the backdrop of it. There are growth deals, there's the levelling up agenda, there's the role of Homes England, and of course, inevitably, when one is dealing with a centralised process of arriving at the number and distributing it, there is going to be the industry of political lobbying. And what this raises, I think, is an important point about how we ensure transparency in the system. And I think one needs to ask early on, is this going to be dealt with at all through the law, or is it going to be dealt with in some way by policy? What is that process going to be? We're told that instead of just arriving at numbers, we are going to be given a constraints-based exercise as well at the national level. Now, what test is going to be applied? How are those constraints in the many local authority areas going to be assessed? And so what will the engagement be, and how will a formal decision be reached? Will there be a formal decision? We don't really know. Will that be the subject potentially of judicial review, either statutory or non-statutory? Because in effect, what one's ending up with here, it seems, is a national plan for housing. Will they take into account at that stage infrastructure viability and other objectives as well? Those are matters which raise the issue of SEA, for instance, which we need to bear in mind in whatever form it eventually comes forward. If there are mayors, joint plans, etc., they may, we're told, have more control over distributing the number within a geographical area, within an administrative area or areas. And so what will happen? Will we, instead of having a regional tier, end up with the existing cluster of sub-regional plans, but maybe a growth area where, in order to gain more control over the distribution of housing, more local authorities, not just mayoral areas, join together in effect as sub-regional plans? And so what about the timescale? This national level has to be a prior exercise, doesn't it, to the local plan process? It's got to be framed by the new law. It's got to have the new policy taken into account. And so over what period is that going to take place? And therefore, how does it relate to the transition into the new system? These are huge challenges, I think, to those who are creating the new system on the ground. It involves more resources, as the paper recognises, both at government level, I suspect at the inspectorate as well, and certainly at local planning authority level, just to engage, frankly, with this national level. Now, there are rolling 5-year periods, as we know, for plans. It looks as though we're going to be reset, if you like, in relation to these national housing figures at a year one. But exactly when that will be is a huge issue, I think, not just in relation to the transition, the 30 or the 42 months that we have. And if you centralise, obviously the burden of credibility for the system shifts towards the centre, which is a political aspect of this that no doubt those at Marsham Street are aware of. So the three colours, briefly, this is a headline point that you'll all no doubt be very familiar with. But for the local planning authority to allot, with guidance certainly from a revised NPPF, but perhaps also law, because one has to have a system like this within a legal framework. So will the examination simply be about sustainability, or will it in fact have legal compliance components to it as well? Will it be a truly spatial plan, or will it mainly be about the delivery outcomes under each of the categories? Because that's obviously where it's had its genesis, certainly in relation to the growth areas. Now, those areas we know are large greenfield sites, regeneration sites. They're substantial in size, but they're envisaged, it seems, largely outside existing urban areas. There's bound to be a crossover, though, isn't there, between greenfield areas or large areas of regeneration and things that would otherwise be, quote, protected. And cutting out or putting those in parameters is going to be quite an important aspect of the process that needs to be the subject of very clear guidance, it seems to me, very early on in the process. In terms of the renewal areas, they're expressly urban in their identity. Those are obviously multifaceted areas. They have overlapping objectives, and they're also very often cross-boundary sites, not just in themselves, but in their effects. And so how are those cross-boundary issues going to be dealt with without a duty to cooperate, which we know is going to be removed, is planned to be removed? The protected category, I think we can all understand the basis for it, but it's presumably iterative, because if it isn't predetermined at the national level, for instance, all the green belts in St Albans, for instance, will have to stay as it is, then it will have to flex in terms of local authority decision making about where the housing sites and the other sites are put. So there has to be some level, it seems to me, of discretionary evaluation at the plan making stage about what is protected, rather than simply taking it as a given. So if that's the case, other than in terms of the feed through to consenting, how different will this be, except in presentational terms on the surface? Because we need to think through, I think, the process of examining the sustainability of the categories, given the procedural consequences, the PIP consequences that flow. Now, I won't take long at all on the growth area allocation effects. We know that it's going to be an outline permission or a planning in principle. And therefore, a local planning authority, all the local planning authorities, one after other in a very short statutory timescale, subject to penalties, are being asked to consent all of the big outline permissions in their areas all at the same time. Now, obviously, that's an enormous challenge for resourcing and also for decision making, because during the plan process, where will the real tensions arise? Not just, I think, in terms of where the sites are, but the master plan, the concept plan, the parameters, governance issues relating to large sites will need to be addressed as part of the plan process rather than left for later. So I think, to take a legal aspect on this, if you get an outline permission simply by being allocated, then you as the owner or promoter are having your rights, I think, potentially determined at that stage, and Article 6 is engaged in a way that the case law on the existing system declares not to be the case, because you haven't got permission at the plan stage at the moment. So there's obviously space for debate for flexible PIPs, which is, or outline permissions, very good for the market in that sense, more flexibility, and perhaps we'll see hybrid, where there's more detail at the front and less at the back. But there's also, of course, space for what I would call resistance to development in there, details perhaps, but still a high hurdle to surmount, actually to end up with an implementable consent and delivery. And so a debate needs to happen, I think, in the next couple of months about the boundary between fixity and flexibility, because obviously with large sites, some things aren't known at the plan making stage and have to be hedged around with caveats in a way that may make even an outline idea difficult in practice, let alone, as I identify in that penultimate bullet point, knitting a DCO process. LDO perhaps slightly easier, but a DCO process into this, given that it comes from an entirely different part of the wood, if you like, is going to have to be looked at extremely carefully if it's going to play a role in a growth area-led system. So we need some worked examples, really, getting going to understand this. And so what's left after that? So I'll just identify briefly 3 points for you. Is this a comprehensive review? How comprehensive a reform is this? The Prime Minister says we're tearing it down and starting it again, but in fact, is it more a lot of rewiring, to take his metaphor, and a new facade rather than a completely new building? Because we don't see anything about quite a lot of the important aspects of the planning system. TWA, we don't see very much really about the 2008 Act, nothing about the Highways Act, a little bit about heritage. All of these things obviously crucially articulating bringing forward schemes. And so we need to understand, is this comprehensive? is it comprehensive enough if we're going to be making this amount of change? Should we be making more than is said in the white paper? Flexibility against fixity is the second item. I think we're going to have, whether it's called section, it won't be called section 38.6, I'm sure, that the principle of section 38.6 is going to be there in some form or another, because we'll be able to make planning applications in any event. What will they be like? Will they be, for instance, applications mapped onto an outline planning permission, which one's already got as a matter of law, and using it as a fallback, for instance? So how will the statutory test of the plan-led presumption be changed in an effective way? And in the end, will weight still be a matter for the decision maker? Well, one assumes it will be. And so how are we going to be defining the legal rules more tightly to limit the discretion, if you like, of the decision maker? Is that something that is left to policy, whereas we know the courts say it's all a matter of weight for the decision maker? Or will we have to go into law, into the legal provisions to achieve that? And so where does that leave the NPPF? Well, we've got paragraph 11, obviously, still there at the moment. It deals with whether a plan is out of date and engages on that score alone the presumption. It has to be kept, it seems to me, in some form or another, because plans don't trot out. They aren't pieces of machinery on a production line. Some of them don't work. Some of them are too slow. There are real problems. Some of them go out of date very quickly and unexpectedly. And so we're going to have some flexibility built into the system through the NPPF as well, it seems to me. So clarity about the national level is an area that I suggest that we focus on, as it were, going forward in the consultation period. A review of the system as a whole. Is it sustainable without a plan? How do the issues of governance and so on work? How do you deal with 38.6 and paragraph 11? Look at it as a whole. And what about the balance between speed and standardization and flexibility and discretion at the local plan stage? Because we can't agree. There are irreconcilable differences, as we know, in planning between stakeholders. And so where will the new system adjust the locations where that pressure is most felt? If you make it harder for discretion to be exercised, it may be at the very early stage. If you make it easier, it's at the later stage. But these are issues which are irreducibly part of planning, however much one tries to standardize. So those are the areas I wanted to touch on in a rather a whistle-stop tour. And I just wonder whether, having looked at some of the questions that have come forward, any of the other panel members wanted to add anything. I mean, I don't know, Richard, for instance, whether you wanted to say anything about the PIPs and the outline planning permission that one would get through the growth areas, because I know that you've got experience of planning in principle and so on in other jurisdictions.
Yes, very interesting talk, Reba, thank you. I think the PIP is obviously something that you expect to see more in a renewal area than maybe you do elsewhere. And let's just take renewal areas first. If a renewal area is essentially a mix and match area, because most areas in town centres, for example, that might expect some renewal, you're going to have parts of town centres that are going to need renewal. You're going to need some parts of town centres that you might wish to expand for certain types of uses, and then you're going to need some protected features of town centres. So you're going to have a bit of a mixed match. But I think if you're going to then get PIP out of it, the question is, what does PIP mean? And if you're going to look at some areas of your renewal area on a sort of LDO style, parameters, heights fixed, uses pre-approved, and you get, let's call it sort of 80–90% along the way towards effectively a planning permission. So you've got 80–90% of the way there, and the prior approval bit of the PIP is only 10%, then it'd be quite valuable. If, however, you need the flexibility to have within a town centre, you know, more spontaneity of what might be needed, some guidelines, but some deviations here and there to allow for some flexibility, then you might only be 60% along the way to getting a consent. So I think, how is a PIP framed? You know, the best position for a developer would be an LDO style. You've got near as damn it a planning permission with very little left for prior approval, but there probably will be a need for some flexibility. And then just on growth areas, I think it was a bit unusual bit in the white paper about outline consents. So if you need EIA for over 150 units or 5 hectares, then you're going to need an outline planning permission application for an EIA, because you're not going to be able to EIA a local plan. So growth areas sub 150 units, sites within growth areas sub 150 units will presumably get a PIP, and sites above 150 units will get an allocation, but would get a PIP, but it wouldn't mean as much, would it? Because you still need an EIA, and that's going to require an application. So the cut-off between the EIA and the non-EIA in a growth area is quite an important point.
I'm with you, Richard. I mean, I think that work must be being done, probably should be done if it's going to be worked through in the way that the headlines are set out in the white paper on potential changes to the EIA system. Yeah. You're absolutely right in what you say about the existing position. But if they want to make it more flexible and have a wider scope, then I think the government will have to look at the EIA regulations, won't they?
Yeah, and they say, obviously we know they're being looked at, so we'll have to look at this issue carefully. But I think the white paper says outline consent, whereas I think it's actually part PIP, part outline consent for growth areas.
Yeah.
In truth.
Yes, I'm with you. I'm with you. I mean, in terms of the housing, I know you're about to do your paper, Zach, but yeah. Just picking up a question. I mean, how difficult is it going to be to do this exercise that we see sketched in at the moment of setting at a national level housing numbers and taking into account relevant constraints as well while doing it?
Well, as you say, Rupert, I'll talk about this a little bit more in a mo. But we shouldn't overlook all the positive elements, obviously, of fixing housing numbers in terms of speeding up the plan making and decision making processes, a drive in the direction of certainty for all users of the system. No blame, I think, no doubt about that. But the challenge of doing this and getting it right is, I think, going to be, and I don't want to be hyperbolic, but absolutely monumental. And I'll discuss it in a sec, but there's at least two kinds of challenge, both of which I think are pretty huge. There's the substantive challenge. What do the formulae look like? What adjustments are made in relation to constraints, and how, it's the point you touched on, Rupert, how are the relativities of those constraints to be computed? Then, even if you get that right, there's a more daunting challenge still, I think, which is a procedural challenge, because whatever the outcome of this national exercise, it's going to be incredibly controversial in all quarters of the planning system, no doubt about it. So there'll have to be some kind of forum to consider and adjudicate somehow on competing submissions for where England's housing should actually go, and designing that kind of forum in a way that's streamlined enough. This is your point, Richard, Rupert, about this balance between fixity and flexibility. It's got to be streamlined enough to meet the demands of the white paper to speed things up. It's also got to be fair. It's got to be democratically accountable. That it ain't going to be easy.
No, I'm with you. But I'm with you, obviously, on the fact that setting housing numbers, I think most of us in the planning world would agree, is something we've been missing since 2010. But how it's done, obviously, as you say, a big challenge. Just very quickly, Jan, I think there's a question which might be good for you to pick up about this heavily signposted shift towards fixity, if you like, through more rules, design codes, and the like, through the local plan, and some kind of running along parallel with it, as opposed to more discretionary and therefore, no doubt, in a pejorative description, time-consuming and uncertain. What do you take? What's your take on that, on the benefits or drawbacks of that change?
Well, it's certainly a substantial change. It could be a real opportunity to deliver on net zero and to make that step change really quickly. So you could see a rule-based approach really driving that agenda and delivery, particularly for new build, particularly in the housing sector. You could even see it apply to PD and extensions and renewals as well, if they wanted to be really radical. And actually, if we're to meet the climate change agenda, and also to have homes that are fit for the future climate change environment and resilient environment, we're actually going to have to grapple with that, which is more than the grant scheme that's so far been trailed by the Chancellor. So it won't just be new build, but it will be in the existing environment and built environment. But no, so a huge opportunity at its best. I think the drawback could be what I fear is referred to a little bit as the pattern book, which is a term that's used, which I find slightly horrifying in potential terms of, will it be backward looking? Will it be a dumbing down? Will it be identikit? And even with the reference to the local design acceptability, which I will come on to in my section, that might actually perpetuate that more. Where's the innovation? Where's the responding to the location, the space, the environment? All of those unique things that create the diversity and richness of the built environment that we particularly have in England, that rich patchwork. So I think on that note, I would vote for the opportunism and for the aspiration of a real step change in delivery. And I would avoid the pattern book to some extent.
Yes. No, I'm with you, and it'd be interesting in due course to hear the views of house builders, for instance, on this, because you know the some of the prejudicial views about house builders is, well, the pattern book, the standard type is their preferred mode of delivery. But in the end, of course, what they're doing is selling a product to a market, and a market is obviously a lot more sophisticated than that in pretty much every case, isn't it? Into what the buildings look like for a start. And so setting a type or types, if you like, at the local planning authority level may be inimical to the market. What the market wants.
Yeah, I think the only area it might be beneficial is there is a little bit of reference to systems build, you know, in terms of delivering housing very quickly and cost effectively. And if that's going to drive really good standards, you know, a sort of 21st century Parker Morris, but for systems build, you know, that could be something. And where you have particular standards of mobility, space, you know, that sort of thing, that could be tremendous. So it's not a complete no on that. It's how it's used and where it's used.
Yes, indeed.
So that we don't end up.
Thank you, Jan. I tell you what, let's let Zach go on housing, because there's a fair amount, Zach, to put it very mildly indeed, to cover in your short slot. So over to you.
There is. Thank you very much, Rupert. If I had to pick one genuinely radical idea in this white paper, I would go for the reformed approach to housing delivery. Why? Well, let's roll back the clocks very briefly to 2010, heady days of Eric Pickles, Secretary of State, and the Localism Bill. As you'll remember, Eric Pickles' centrepiece planning reform was the devolution of housing targets from Whitehall down to local planning authorities by abolishing regional strategies, which we were told at the time, as you may remember, top-down edicts imposed on communities in a way that was anti-democratic, didn't work, numbers produced by Soviet-style quangos, bureaucrats poisoning the planning system, all of which added up to a quote, Eric Pickles' words, obviously, not mine, a national disaster. Well, how far we've come. The era of letting local planning authorities set their own housing numbers, subject only to a duty to cooperate with their neighbours, is all of about 9 years old. But our current Secretary of State doesn't seem to think it's all worked out very well. And the proposed solution takes us back to the future. As Rupert said, the centrepiece of this white paper's approach to housing is the hoovering back up of responsibility for setting housing numbers into central government. It really is, I think, a radical rethinking of the balance of power between the ministry and local planning authorities. And that rebalance expresses itself through the proposal for a new, quote unquote, binding housing target for each council to meet through their local plans. That's the big idea. No negotiation up, no negotiation down, it's all fixed by the ministry, and no debate about objectively assessed needs being adjusted to accommodate policy on constraints. And that's because those constraints are already, as Rupert said, baked into the figures, which will be handed down, no doubt, on tablets of stone from MHCLG. But here's the prize: a local plan examination with no discussion at all of the appropriate housing target. That's a radical shift indeed from these days. But how might it actually work? Rupert's already raised some of the really important questions. I'll return to them in a moment. Under this brave new world, as Rupert said, no more duty to cooperate, still no regional plans. When it comes to cross-boundary issues, we've got a proposal that councils could, but would not be required to agree amongst themselves to redistribute their housing needs. Well, okay, but given the recent number of local plans which have hit skids on account of failing the duty to cooperate, well, I think we should perhaps think very carefully about how likely it is that effective agreements are regularly going to be struck between LPAs, particularly in those areas heavily constrained by protective designations like Greenbelt. And as Rupert said, role of mayors in overseeing the strategic distribution of housing numbers across their area gets a mention, doesn't get any detail, though obviously, particularly in the London context, given the enormous likely increase in London's housing targets, see the consultation on the standard method, role of the mayor is going to be critical. The housing delivery test is to be kept, as Rupert said, as is the presumption at paragraph 11 of the current NPPF if you fall foul of the HDT. On the other hand, as Rupert's explained, there's a new separate proposal of a new statutory presumption in favour of sustainable development, a sort of bulked up section 38.6. So we'll have to see how that statutory presumption interacts with the one that we currently have in the NPPF, if both are to be retained. In any event, we're told it's the end of the road after almost 15 years for the requirement to show a 5-year housing land supply. Why? Because the new approach to plan making, quote, should ensure that enough land is planned for and with sufficient certainty about its availability for development to avoid the continuing requirement to show a 5-year deliverable supply of housing land. I think that's an absolutely critical assumption that this white paper makes, i.e. that the regular updating of these new pared down local plans will in itself ensure that enough land is planned for which is available for housing. And I will return to that in a moment. What does a housing allocation actually look like in this brave new world? Well, it depends, and Richard said a lot about this already in answer to Rupert. The variation, the sliding scale, is going to be substantial, and the extent of that variation is, I think, really important, because on one end of the spectrum, as Richard said, you might find your site in a growth area or a renewal area subject only to height, density and use parameters, which may be good news, of course. But it might leave you, as Richard said, with a lot of work to do on master planning, layout, design, infrastructure, all sorts of other reserved matters before you've got a consent that's really worth the having. One step on, maybe those same parameters, but layered over with the design codes or pattern books that Jan's just been talking about, which may or may not form part of the adopted local plan, but in any event, might give you more guidance on what's likely to be acceptable and maybe even some PD rights to get on and build. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you might have a local development order and or a site scheme specific master plan, which could even be part of the adopted local plan, which would of course maximize your certainty and one would hope in due course the ease of delivery. But I note this menu of possibilities on the slide because for all the simplicity the government's after through this new breed of local plans, it might not always be easy or even possible to quantify how many homes are actually intended to come forward in the different parts of the different zones and in what form, and more on that in a moment. I note briefly on the slide, and we don't need to go into the new sped up local plan processes, which will give those promoting residential led schemes a chance to get involved and influence the outcome, albeit streamlined. The overall idea is pretty comparable to what we're doing at the moment, although we'll not be addressing the soundness test anymore in our reps, as Rupert said. It's all going to be about the new sustainable development test, because all of us know exactly what that means, apparently. So if any of the several hundred of you on this webinar know, perhaps you can tell all of us on the Q&A function. Often in the brave new world of the white paper, as is of course the case now, allocation isn't the end of the story. There's much discussion in the white paper, and again, Richard's touched on some of it already, on how the outline permission, or PIP, conferred by falling into the growth zone can be parlayed into a full detailed consent, might require traditional reserve matters applications unless you've managed to secure an LDO supported by a master plan. If your scheme is large enough, a new settlement, for example, the white paper suggests extending the DCO process, something Rupert's touched on, to large scale resi schemes, something perhaps Jan can be asked about later on. In renewal areas, you'll need either a planning application or an LDO, unless you're on this PD fast track to beauty, which again, Jan will return to. And in the protect areas, you'll need a planning permission, same as now. and in any of the zones, you can always put in an application, a point Rupert's made, for planning permission for something that doesn't accord with the plan, which presumably would have to be determined, as Rupert said, against a version of what we now think of as Section 38.6. But without a 5-year housing land supply target to test whether a plan is likely to deliver what it says on the tin, and possibly without TBD, the related concepts of plans being out of date when they fall behind the 5-year housing land supply curve, the routes of securing permission in areas which are designated as protect areas may, I think, become more challenging than they are today. And that's a problem. If alongside Greenbelt and AONB, and note, of course, the one thing this white paper says nothing about at all is rethinking the approach to development in the Greenbelt. If alongside with Greenbelt and AONB, that the protect designation is intended to apply to all kinds of things, large range of locally designated sites of different sorts, general deemed open countryside, so the swathes of land outside settlement boundaries, which may have no particular environmental qualities worthy of protection under the current NPPF, conservation areas, which again raises a particular issue in cities like London, where very substantial areas of central activities zones, for example, are designated conservation areas. So lots to be thought through there. And I've just put a question mark at the bottom of the slide. Appeals. Well, with all of these needs for applications of various sorts for prior approvals, reserve matters, DCOs, possibly, traditional planning applications, there'll still be a route, and there's still envisaged, it would seem, to be a route up to the planning inspectorate. Secretary of State can still call in different sorts of application. Now, the white paper expects there to be fewer appeals because of all this certainty about which the 3 zones are going to confer. Well, we'll have to wait and see about that one. I list here a series of questions. I know in some you're supposed to be asking us the questions, but I've got some questions for all of you. Enormous questions which arise out of these ideas in the white paper, just on the issue of housing, and some of them don't yet have answers. How will the new fixed binding targets, which will apparently take account of environmental constraints in each area, actually be calculated? How will the numbers work? The question I asked Rupert earlier on. Who does the maths? Who makes what we now think of as the policy on decisions on how to reflect constraints? Enormously important. How do politicians, councils, the development industry, and indeed everyone else interact with this new process to avoid the same charges of being anti-democratic and all the rest of it, which spelled the end for regional strategies? Are we on for some kind of examination style process, some sort of public inquiry, a written consultation process? We get literally nothing on this massively important question, indeed central really, in the white paper, the way that all of the rest of it works. And note that albeit there's a consultation on the current standard method in the other consultation paper, the one we're not talking about so much, changes to current planning system in that one. That's a very different animal, because it doesn't seek to produce a binding housing requirement figure. It seeks to produce your local housing need, your standardised LAM, which is the starting point of that exercise, not the ending point. So whatever approach to the numbers the government does come up with on this issue, it's going to have to be new. Something else we don't know, given the sliding scale of specificity that I've talked about already, that Richard's talked about. Now, when planning inspectors or anyone else comes to examine these issues at an examination, how will they be able to tell precisely how many units are being allocated in a given plan, and whether or not that's going to be enough to meet needs? The concept of deliverability of housing sites, which until now, as we know, has been a really important touchstone for assessing whether the plan is actually likely to do its job in the real world, it's got no obvious place in this new world, devoid of a requirement to show 5-year housing land supply. Because say, for example, a local plan decides to shift its housing delivery into renewal zones, it's perfectly allowed to do that in principle. No automatic grants of permission or outlines or PIPs, no requirement for master plan, no schemes yet, just broad parameters. So there'll need to be planning applications in a way that resembles the sort of world that we're living in at the moment to meet the housing targets fixed by central government. We may well not know when the plan is adopted, or potentially for many years afterwards, how many homes this plan actually likely to deliver against the target, how and when and where the units are going to come. I've touched already on risks of inflexibility in the protect zone. If we no longer have a possibility of plans being treated as out of date through a lack of 5-year housing land supply, given the wide range of designations which are caught by the protect zone and the fact that constraints will somehow be baked into the housing target, as I've said, overly rigid treatment of planning applications for sites within the protect zone may become a real problem, which could actually hinder the prospects for, say, edge of settlement greenfield housing applications, of which of course there are several hundred every year, compared to the system that we've already got. Neighbourhood plans, we've already had lots of questions on the Q&A about that, and I will say very briefly, passing the buck completely to Jan, that they can set, we were told, local design codes, but no, what can't they do? They can't allocate sites for housing, or they can't deallocate land for housing. Their role, that function that they can perform, if they wish to at the moment, is removed from them. And a final question about how we can make sure that the site-specific infrastructure to support a housing scheme is actually delivered, absent the Section 106 mechanism. But Richard's saying all sorts about 106, so I'll leave that to him. So those are my slides. Thank you very much indeed. And I wondered whether, in a similar way, I might be able to just pick the brains of our panelists for a few minutes. I wondered whether, Rupert, I could ask you a question. You've got lots of experience of the dynamics of the 2011 and 12 reforms, indeed the 2018 NPPF, 2019 NPPF. Is there any reason, do you think, that we should believe that the proposal for these sort of quote unquote top-down housing numbers fixed by central government are going to avoid the problems which bedeviled and ultimately brought down regional strategies?
Well, I mean, I think what brought down regional strategies, of course, is a very complicated subject on all of its own, because we almost had a proper tier of regional strategies, and we almost had a democratic accountability system that went along with it. They were, if already seems so long ago, but they were, if you remember, evidence-based. The housing was based on regional schmars, if you like, and this is not really the same. I think there's a big question about the extent to which the 300,000 target and how it's divided is really, to use the old language now, anything about housing need in that sense, objectively assessed need, rather than rightly or wrongly a policy target, which the government feels very strongly should be aimed at. And so, I mean, I think that there are different issues about the legitimacy, probably, of what's being proposed at the moment compared to the regional tier. Different issues about, as you said, how the constraints go together with the numbers in sub-regional areas and indeed local authority areas, which I think again is a quite different dynamic. But in the end, as you say, it's even further top down, if you like, than the regional strategies were. And I think there will be many stakeholders who think that's a very good thing for certainty and speed of delivery, etc. Shorter local plan inquiries, EIPs. But there will be others who strongly oppose it, obviously on the basis of what it does to democratic accountability and local decision making. And the localism agenda, if you read what was going on just before the 2010 election, in the manifestos and so on, we seem to be in a different universe, let alone a different world.
Absolutely.
But that's all I can offer, I think, at the moment.
I thought the same. Thank you very much. It's very interesting. I can't resist asking Jan, with her experience, about the opportunities mooted at in the white paper about using the DCO regime for larger scale residential development. Jan, in your considerable experience of that regime, what was your takeaway when you saw those proposals?
It's been talked about for quite a while, and there's been some academic research around it and some proposals. I think it has potential, done effectively and done well and done at scale. I think it's only really suitable for the sort of, certainly not below 5,000 and maybe not below 10,000 units. But also it does suit mixed development as well. I think the issue really is people are nervous about DCO being too detailed, too prescriptive right from the off. But there's absolutely no reason it has to be. There is no reason that it can't follow a very similar format to the LDO in terms of delivering that large scale master planned development with design codes, which is what we're talking about here. You know, London Gateway, I know it's a port, but that was a very large LDO, which has had design principles that everything's been brought forward with. Now, there's no reason you can't deliver that in a DCO format with all its joined up consenting and all its relevant powers that brings land interests together. It makes it happen. It removes some of those obstacles. It is an incredibly powerful tool. So done well, done rightly, with that flexibility, I think it could be a tremendous tool at scale.
That's very interesting. Thank you so much. And Richard, I wondered whether I could just ask you about something that's got lots of my clients hopping up and down already, which actually emerges from the changes to the current planning system consultation, the sister consultation to the full white paper, which is the temporary raising of the small site threshold for affordable housing contributions up to 40 or 50 units TBD, to respond to the economic consequences of the last few months of lockdown and the rest of it. Do you have a view? Do you have a view on that?
Yes, get in quick, I think, is the truth of the matter. I think it's an opportunity that I suspect won't be too short-lived, because what the thrust of these reforms are trying to capture more contributions towards affordable housing and infrastructure, and we'll come on to the levy later on, including, for example, permitted development for change of use, for example, being caught for office to resi conversion. So take advantage of that temporary raising of the threshold if you're a developer. Obviously, if you're a local authority, it's a concern in the short term, because you might not get as much affordable housing right now. However, with the current COVID situation, a measure to progress house building in the short term, probably quite sensible. Quite a bold move to do it and raise it so high, I think, you know, in the short term, but it is only a short-term measure. I just wanted to pick up a quick point, Zach, if I may, on the question. I noticed a really interesting question about what happens on PIP if you've got the 5 years of the plan, and then it says here there's a risk that if you know, what happens after the plan expires and you move on to the next plan? Are you at risk if your PIP hasn't been activated? I mean, when you look at countries like Australia, and I've got experience in New South Wales and Victoria, for example, when zoning and PIP style mechanisms exist, if you haven't activated any proposal pursuant to your zonal allocation within the plan period, you are at risk. If you have, then you're not. So it's quite interesting that, you know, the question is, if you're on that sort of sliding scale, how far percentage-wise do you need to press the button to be safe in case you're de-allocated within your zone next time? So
I think that's a absolutely brilliant question. I think, you know, it's one of those that I don't even know where to start, really, because that's the kind of detail that we've not yet got. I've heard this referred to by some of it, so people who contributed to it, as a high level headlines paper, and that is that sort of question that you've asked me, or that you passed on, is just the kind of thing that as soon as you start to sort of scratch under the surface, and an absolutely crucial issue for lots of people it will be if we ever get a system like this. How much do you have to do in order to maintain your position should the plan run out?
And I think, Zach, if I could just offer a short thought on that occurred to me where Richard was answering that excellent question. The the plans, I think, are intended to be at least 10 years, aren't they? With a 5-year review,
Mhm.
a rolling review. They're not intended to be 5-year plans. The wrong connotation, I think, with that. But a 10-year plan to be reviewed. Obviously, if you've got something which is in the plan, which may have a PIP, a partial PIP or a full PIP or whatever it may be, which was put in the plan with a build out to take the entire 10-year period, then it can't be out of date, I think, in inverted commas, by the time you do your review at year 5. And so this, but you're right, this will absolutely have to be clarified, maybe in the law, not just in the policy.
Quite.
I think the extent to which what is a review capable of doing is quite an important point on that.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I just thought I'd pick up one other quick point. I know we need to move on, but another good question about, in the event of PIPs being granted effectively overnight, if you have a PIP by allocation, could you have an unintended consequence in respect of land values? So the owner might not want an uplift in value because they might not want the book value and depreciation. You know, they might not want to realise the value straight away. And obviously, there would normally be an uplift in value from an allocation as it stands. The question is, what extra value does a PIP give you? That's the sliding scale question again.
I think it is, Richard. I think it is. And obviously, you know, it's a brave new world, but the valuers will become, if we do get a system that resembles this, one that's proposed, become used to this sliding scale idea that you've sketched out, Richard, and the implications that arriving at different points on that sliding scale have for values, but is there potential for unintended consequences in terms of changes in value overnight? It would seem absolutely. I think very interesting questions of degree. I better pass the baton on to Jam, which I am very happy to do, who I think is going to talk about a range of matters, but in particular the environment and the beauty agenda.
So, over to beauty. What a term to use. I'll start quickly with its simplification of assessment process. So what's this about? So it basically seeks to challenge us. Not enough to focus on design. At the moment, there's little incentive for high quality new homes and places except on a bespoke basis. And this is what they're saying this is aimed at. Interesting, embedded at the front end of the white paper, it does say that planning matters. Some of the rhetoric, you might not think that, but there is a really clear statement that planning matters. And I vote for that one. Because places absolutely affect us. Air we breathe, the purpose, well-being, all of the things that really have been coming out during COVID. And a question of social justice. Now, although this is the front end and not a lot of this comes out in the detail, I do hope as we progress and the detail gets put on the bones, that these elements are not lost, and that the elements of stewardship of countryside and environment and those emphasis and the levers for push and pull on that are really embedded within that. So natural and heritage assets, brownfield land maximised where it's appropriate, net gains and biodiversity and the wider environment. Remember, we've got the Environment Bill, and obviously most urgently climate change. So that sort of sets the scene of what the government is saying are the issues and where some of these proposals are going to drive at. So I'm just going to pick up on the proposals that really go to environment and design matters. And really this kicks off in Pillar 1 on the sustainable development. There's been lots of questions about that already, and we might come to it in a little bit of our panel discussion in a moment as well, maybe to explore a bit further. I'm not sure, we're very clear on what sustainable development is now, and certainly I don't have a feel yet for what it's intended to be in the white paper world and in the new planning system. I think there will need to be a lot of consideration about that, really aimed on what's its purpose and what are the outcomes that we're trying to gain from that, and then work back from that and make sure it's established on that basis. But it's about simpler tests, fewer requirements for assessments is said, simplification. And specifically, we're going to abolish sustainability appraisal and develop simplified environmental impacts of plans, but to continue to satisfy UK and international law and treaties. Now, that's an interesting caveat. Although they do posit an alternative option, which is a reform of the soundness tests, but less prescriptive, but I'm not really sure where that would get us to in a tested environment. So in terms of streamlining and simplicity, it might make it more easy to grapple with, but what that is in the detail will be interesting while sustaining those mapped commitments that we have in the environment field. Pillar 2, this is the one that really focuses on what they say as beautiful and sustainable places. And really we go through from 11 to 18, pretty much picking up all the elements. We've talked a little bit about binding design guidance and codes prepared locally, which is sort of a follow-on from the question I answered earlier. Now, interesting that you're going to have to demonstrate that it's provably locally popular design codes. Now, can you imagine, could we be running referendum on this in the same way that we have to do for neighbourhood plans? How do we prove that it's locally popular design codes, and popular with whom and what proportion? And will that be ambitious, challenging and innovative? That really could be a real tripwire. And I know it some way goes to giving a purpose to the new form of neighbourhood plan, which is going to be pretty much limited to local design in this context, which is very much how it's set out. Fast track for beauty, very interesting. If you weight beauty over all other things, will that give you a balanced, spatially defined and appropriately integrated development, which creates place and actually delivers? And if that's an incentive to accelerate high quality development, that's good, as long as that's not just facadism, but it is real delivery of that sustainable place, which meets all of those ambitions that I set out in that first slide. Reform to mitigate and adapt to climate change. You know, who could argue against that? Maximising environmental benefits. Quicker and simpler assessment, we talked about briefly. Conserving and enhancing historic buildings and areas, and ambitions for energy standards and delivering net zero. All good stuff. So, what are the opportunities and risks? I'm just going to run through a few. Abolition of sustainability appraisal and soundness. So what will that sustainable development test be? Do we really know? It could be really positive and holistic, create better transparency and diagnosis of the challenges. It could actually start by setting out that you have to look at what the issues are. Now, wouldn't that be radical? And then develop in accordance with identifying how you address those and deliver the interventions and outcomes that create that sustainability. However, the risk is that we have endless debate on what sustainable development is, or it's challenged ad nauseum. A new field for barristers in the High Court, I feel, coming upon us. But no detail on how the simplified process can provide that level of protection and legal compliance at the moment. And that really will need to be worked through. So, you focus on design and sustainability. Will the potential realised standards and codes actually be realised? And will a design chief officer really have an effect on that local delivery? I think we'll need more than one officer in terms of capacity building skills and that particular engagement and bringing the popular support for that along with us. If we could not ignite the interest in planning like the Blue Planet did on plastic, we would be in a very different place on this. But that's quite a task and quite an ask. In terms of the improved role of Homes England, that could be really valuable and could give us some leadership and some skills and resources to go along with it, and particularly deliver on public projects. However, the risk is that loss of diversity and uniqueness of place and innovation. Visual over substance, I've already said about the provably locally popular tripwire. So, how do we continue to create the rich and diverse communities for future generations? And will we lose that unique tapestry that really is the character of England? And actually, a lot of our tourism industry is based on that, not the identikit vanilla that can come from set codes and applications that are enforced. So really one that could be an opportunity, but has real risk in it that we should avoid. So the new system of environmental assessment, I think there's going to be a lot more to come on this. It's been trailed as coming out in the autumn, and I know it's been looked at. It has become a bit of an industry, and actually there's always a lot talked about proportionate EIA, proportionate environmental assessment. But nobody's brave enough to do it because nobody wants to be the person that's asked for that additional information or challenged over what they haven't done. If this allows us to do that by prescription and really focus on the essential things, that will be beneficial for everyone and the outcomes. So rationalising the duplication of effort and making it proportionate and transparent would be hugely beneficial and have a much better purpose. But we do need to align that against a unified set of legal tests so we know what we're doing. It's not a case by case. We really know what we're aiming at and delivering against. Bring that certainty. And also use of a combined baseline methodology, big data, digital inclusive platforms has real potential here. And so we don't get that constant duplication of work and out-of-date data. And also using the monitored information to really inform that front end. We all hear about, well, modeling's just not the real world. Let's use real data and make it adaptive. But the risk is that it becomes a second-rate assessment. It's unidentified and unmitigated harm, and failure to meet our legal and international obligations and be the best that it can be. And also it's going to have to be integrated with the 25-year environment plan, and really must take that on board in delivery. And the fast track for beauty, will this just be de-risk standardisation? That could be a real risk. And on that thought, I will end there for some discussion and just pick up on a few of the questions that have been coming in this area. A lot of it aimed really around sustainable development. But Richard, maybe you could help me first. I mean, do you think sustainable development will need redefining to fit with its new sort of central billing, central starring role, really? I mean, have you got some thoughts you could share with us on that?
Yes, I think obviously the NPPF covers sustainable development as it stands. I think additional, and the Sustainable Development Commission references are clearly helpful. I think the two new additions that might be worthy of consideration are the net gain debate as to whether we're looking at net gain, and net gain of what? Biodiversity, carbon, in terms of carbon reduction. So what are we looking for there, and what's sensible? And then secondly, beauty. Do we want to inject any element of beauty into sustainable development? Bearing in mind it's not just what it says on the tin, is it sustainable development, it's what's presumed for the purposes of planning permission. So the type of development we want. So I think those are the two areas that I would watch out for in terms of any potential incorporation into the definition. I mean, there are toolkits obviously available already looking at these things. ICENI, I know I've got one, for example, they worked up with the Sustainable Development Commission. So it will be interesting. Trying to define that in a statutory test is inexorably going to have to refer to guidance, I think.
No, that's excellent. And you know, the ICENI checklist, if you like, would be something that could be picked up for the development plan position as well. You know, could we have, you know, a checklist that we could work to and make it easier to see that this is done. Yeah. So I think just with time on our mind, I'm going to move straight to Richard's presentation. Richard, would you like to wrap us up with your presentation? Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So I'm doing the last 10 minutes on this, and then we'll have 10-15 minutes or so for questions on general topics at the end. So mine is the marvellous levy and potential abolition of section 106. So I'm going to run you through proposals on that. So the context is the report that's done and updated every year by the government on developer contributions. The latest one, updated same time as the white paper, reveals a £1 billion increase in CIL and 106 take from 6 billion to 7 billion, of which interestingly 12% is CIL. So the lion's share is affordable housing, 67% or so, and then 21% or so for other infrastructure. So the overall aim of the white paper is to try and increase the amount of money taken for developer contribution. So that's the number we're looking at. And the enemies are time spent negotiating agreements, dark art of viability discussions, and perceptions of inefficiency and inconsistency in capturing land value uplift. So there's a massive focus by government, has been for some time, on can we have more land value capture. So those are things that came out of the surveys and interviews as part of the academic study that they do frequently looking at CIL 106. So what does what in the short term with the separate consultation, just worthy of note, is that there is a short immediate term minor change to the CIL regulations, which I suspect are going to be with us for some time, to allow first homes, obviously the new category of affordable homes, to be eligible for relief like any other types of affordable housing. So I thought I would just mention that. We're just moving on then to the proposals for the new levy itself. 19 to 22 proposals. Nationally set levy, so fixed proportion of the final development value. So, you know, we're looking at GDV. An assessment of the sales value if development is not sold. So if you, in rental terms, then it's an assessment as opposed to the actual value of sale. To be set nationally in a single rate or area specific rates, it's absolutely key. So are we going to try and have a single rate across the country, or are we going to have probably much more sensibly area specific rates? If you don't have area specific rates and you've got a single rate, then you're going to see some parts of the country having very little levy, where you've got lower development values, and some parts of the country with much higher levy. So it seems slightly counterintuitive to the levelling up agenda if, for example, some of the locations where you're seeing viability challenges are in northern areas of the country. But the aim is to increase national revenue, so that will have to be looked at carefully. And I think area-specific rates would be the way to go. Revenue to be collected and spent locally. So if you're not careful, then local authorities who want infrastructure, if it was dealt with nationally, may feel somewhat aggrieved that they've not got what they wanted. Paid at the point of occupation, which is a big change from CIL, not commencement, which is what CIL is, but figure based on the applicable rate at the point the planning permission is granted. So you have certainty of what the rate is when the planning permission is granted. Obviously the value is upon completion, so upon occupation. Sorry, completion, and then occupation is when you pay the levy. Would cover all use classes and development above a certain value-based viability threshold. So this is when do you pay the levy. And notice reflecting average build costs per square metre, and average is the key word here. So if you're looking at a national levy, averaging is always going to be very, very difficult. If you're looking even at an area-based set of build costs, it can be challenging, as we know from some examinations so far. A small fixed allowance for land costs slightly fills me with dread. What is that small fixed allowance? No doubt government would like it to be very small, not necessarily the case in the real world. Would include affordable housing, so that's obviously a key change. So CIL can't be spent on affordable housing, new levy affordable housing would be incorporated, and on-site in-kind provision or on-site or off-site land would count as an offset against the levy. And interestingly, land as part of land in kind has gone right down over the years, when you look at that background study, to a very small percentage now of developer contributions. Developers don't like giving away land, they're more inclined to provide affordable housing. So I deal with on-kind affordable housing, on-site in-kind affordable housing provision in a slide to follow. And then all other Section 106 planning obligation contributions, all of that would be included in the new levy is the proposal. So that would mean the abolition of Section 106. Now, we'll come on to that. More about the levy, it would apply to changes of use which require planning permission or a PD. So big extension there of what was previously the case. So office to resi conversions, not just new floor space, would be captured. So that would increase, obviously, let's call it the tax take from what we have so far on SIL and 106. Not necessarily always going to be conducive to, therefore, accelerating that office to resi conversion if you've suddenly now got a levy to pay. So that's interesting. Maintain current SIL exemptions for self and custom build from the new levy are the only two referred to. Are we going to see other SIL exemptions carried through? Mayor of London SIL and potential combined authority SIL would still be retained. So it's going to work in conjunction with that. Low value areas, obviously the viability threshold may not be exceeded. In high value areas, it's going to be exceeded. And so that's the problem when you're looking at averaging out on a national basis in terms of viability threshold. Allow local authorities to borrow against infrastructure levy. So it wouldn't necessarily, that's a good idea, I think, but it wouldn't necessarily always be used for infrastructure. They could be, it says in the consultation, using for other council priorities, council tax, funding core planning services and the like. I think that's a bit of a retrograde step. If you're looking to have a levy for infrastructure, it really ought to be spent on infrastructure, it seems to me. And it's not clear, other than for affordable housing, whether works in kind by developers would be an offset against the levy. So, for example, if you build a school or GP surgery, is that an offset against the levy? Not clear at this stage. Obviously, the angel or the devil is in the detail. We'll have to wait and see. An alternative option is proposed or floated. An infrastructure levy, instead of being mandatory, could be optional and set by local authorities, but they're still determined to abolish Section 106. So the idea there would be an incentive to impose the levy, and that's the only other alternative option floated. So moving on to what I said I'll come on to on-site affordable housing in kind offset against the levy. So you have this on-site in kind provision would count as an offset, could be made mandatory where an authority has a requirement, capability and wishes to do so. So local authorities seem to be the ones to be empowered to decide whether on-site in-kind provision is required. Presumably developers could still voluntarily provide, but if local authorities want it, they can require it. Local authorities to have the means to specify, note not agree, so specify the forms and tenures of the on-site provision, working with a nominated RP. So it goes through, RP buys the unit at a discount, the discount against market rate would be the in-kind offset against the levy. So, well, the issue there is that wouldn't be, as it is now, largely agreed in Section 106. It would be set out by the local authority as to what forms and tenures would be needed. Is that really practical and sensible? First homes discount, so 30% discount for first homes would be offset against the levy. So that's captured as part of affordable housing. And then interesting mechanism floated about a dynamic response set of options in relation to market downturn. So it floats the idea of local authorities could be allowed to flip a proportion of affordable units if the market tanks back to market units where the affordable housing in kind offset has become greater than the levy itself. So if you're suddenly in negative territory on the offset versus the levy, then local authorities would be allowed to flip that proportion of affordable housing units back to market units. They float an alternative saying the developer could have rights, no rights to reclaim overpayments. So, essentially, these are the market sort of dynamic response options floated. And it says, and I noted this, The government can provide standardised agreements to codify risk sharing. Well, hallelujah, an agreement was floated as a possibility. And if you need an agreement to do that, then you might want to retain the ability to agree to do certain other things, which we'll come on to. It also says to avoid poor quality homes to be built and no RP wants them, that local authority have the option to revert back to cash contributions. So complex and new system, and you do wonder whether it's really worth it, having spent many years going through the trials and tribulations and improvements most recently in relation to SIL. The alternative right to purchase option is the other option that's floated for on-site affordable housing. Right of first refusal of local authority or RP to buy up a set proportion of on-site units on a square metre basis at a discounted price, so broadly equivalent to build costs. Portion would be set nationally, and developer would have discretion over which units were sold in this way. So that's an alternative way of dealing with the affordable housing. Threshold for smaller sites below which on-site delivery would not be required, and a cash payment can be made in lieu. Where on-site units are purchased, these could be used for affordable housing or sold on or back to the developer to raise money to purchase affordable housing elsewhere. And the local authority could then use levy funds or other funds to purchase units. So it's always envisaged, almost always envisaged, that it's local authorities who are going to be delivering a lot of this affordable housing in that mechanism. Obviously, they would work in conjunction with RPs, but there's this underlying theme of wanting local authorities to do more affordable housing themselves, which will chime with many local authorities with their local housing companies. So just to conclude with a few issues, standard rate averaging drawbacks. I mentioned this already. If you go down the standard averaging for the purposes of a national levy in particular, you always end up with the inherent averaging problem. You have to reconcile these different site costs and values. For example, greenfield and urban costs and values clearly are going to differ, and they're going to differ across the country. You have to end up with a levy that's either set reasonably low, like mayoral SIL, for example, but then you haven't got 106 top up, or indeed SIL to top it up. You've got this new levy, so that's not really very practical. Or a higher rate, and then you have exceptions. But if you have exceptions, then you have to reintroduce some negotiation and therefore inexorably agreements. So you think, well, it's quite difficult to do what's being proposed on a national basis, easier on an area-wide basis, I think. Phasing clarity, phasing and timing for payments for large and phased developments needs explanation. So obviously something that's looked at carefully for SIL purposes and indeed in 106s. Occupation of block, phases or unit triggers. Is it really any better than SIL? Well, a large amount depends on the detail, but are we going to have the same discounts and exemptions is a key question. Clearly, we're going to need, hopefully, clearer and better legislation and procedural regulations. I would point out, and everyone knows, that the latest SIL reforms were well received. I'd be very interested to know what Liz Peace's view of this, these levy proposals are, having spent so long improving SIL. I don't think it's a good idea that levy should be used for wider purposes. I do think it should be spent on infrastructure. And on-site affordable housing, well, you know, agreements are still likely to be needed regarding the specification and the terms and value transfer of the affordable housing units. Otherwise, how do you know what the offset is? So why not keep Section 106 agreements in place to help deal with that? Of course, 106 doesn't just deal with contributions, it deals with a variety of things. It secures the affordable housing in perpetuity. It gives local people priority in taking affordable dwellings. It secures sustainable transport methods. It encourages the employment of local people. It provides retail units of affordable rent. It secures open space, schools, doctors' surgeries and community facilities. It secures mitigation. So it's important that government understand what they're proposing here, because 106s are not all about levy on contributions. In-kind non-affordable housing works, already mentioned this. Will we have an offset for non-affordable housing infrastructure? Really, really important that can be done. So finally, opportunities. Well, what's good and what's not so good? Well, this is a personal opinion. I think allowing a levy to be worked out for each local authority area would be sensible. A clear methodology on how that should be done could be set out in guidance, which I think would be highly advantageous. Allow levy to be spent on affordable housing. Yes, I think that is a good idea. it will slim down 106 agreements, and I do think that will save time and money. However, I do think that you're going to still need further detail, obviously, on in-kind and how that will work and offset, and some of the ideas are quite interesting and reasonably sensible with more detail. But you're still going to, in my view, need the 106 to deal with some site-specific matters and area-specific requirements of local authorities to satisfy the housing need properly. I think that it's a good idea to charge levy on occupation. I think that will eliminate viability reviews. Obviously, it's a very tricky thing to decide what's best for cash flow, which is obviously commencement, versus cash flow for delivering infrastructure, that is, versus occupation, which gives you certainty and avoids reviews. But I think on balance, occupation is something I would support. I think it's important that payments can be done by instalments, the works in kind, it can be done for all works, not just affordable housing, and that we do have all of those exemptions that are carried forward from SIL. Section 106 agreements could still be slimmed down, national model form produced, timescale speeded up, which is one of the key mischiefs. Because the levy would include affordable housing, you would slim down radically what the 106s would do in relation to affordable housing, and there wouldn't be that much left to agree, and ergo, hopefully, therefore, speed it up. But 106s do perform these important other roles. I do think that the levy should be spent on infrastructure, and I do think that allowing borrowing against levy receipts is really important to allow that forward funding of infrastructure. But I do think local authorities are going to need some helpful guidance on what level of risk to take and how to do that, so we don't end up with some of the issues that people have been concerned about with tax increment finance. So that was my quick canter through what the levy proposals are. Obviously, there's an awful lot to discuss in relation to that, but I think I'm going to hand back to Rupert just to conclude with some general Q&A for the last few minutes.
Thank you very much, Richard. Dense, packed with all sorts of interesting stuff, I think, that paper. And I mean, frankly, we could have done the whole hour and a half, couldn't we? Just on your topic, but thank you very much for being so comprehensive as well as concise. I think we should just focus on 3 or 4 questions that have arisen we've been picking up from the Q&A. I thought the first one, just staying with viability just for a moment, Richard. Infrastructure levy and viability, the viability of the infrastructure levy. I mean, we know that SIL obviously goes through local testing, etc. How do you think it's going to work with the infrastructure levy, and how's it going to work in, for instance, when the government's looking at whether it's right to allocate a certain number of houses to a certain area?
Well, it's very, very difficult, isn't it? Because there would need to be a national standard viability model. How do you do that? There's an awful lot of disagreement about how viability models ought to work. Clearly a lot of good work over the last few years, particularly in London and some of the major metropolitan cities, of how to try and standardise those, but still an awful lot of disagreement. But you would have to do that. That would be a prerequisite of having a standard model. I think you would then obviously be looking very carefully at values and the costs on those viability models, and that's where you get into the averaging problem. Strikes me as, frankly, very, very difficult to achieve on a national basis. I think the only way that the levy is going to succeed, and I do think it's a good idea that it does capture affordable housing, and I do think that provides a useful route to delivering affordable housing and speeding up Section 106 agreements massively. But I do think the only way it's going to work is with area-based viability assessment like SIL, using the same types of models that have been approved and utilised in SIL examinations, but perhaps more standardised where possible.
Yeah, I have nothing to add to that, Richard. I think that's absolutely right. Just to change subjects completely and come back on the question of fast track and so on. Quite a lot of this is obviously aimed at making the whole system simpler and quicker. And we know that there's been a lot of political pushback, if you like, and objection to some of the negative consequences of the permitted development, office to resi and so on, not just in the press, in the planning world in general, some of which is no doubt justified. The fast track to beauty, though, Jan, just coming back to that, I mean, it seems to me, somebody asks, well, does that mean that if you're not on the fast track, you can get permission for something ugly if you wait long enough? I mean, I'm not sure it does mean, I mean, it's a great question, but I'm not sure it does mean that, but it's a binary thing, isn't it? A fast track, like the 35% affordable in London. If you are beautiful, then you go a particular way and it's quicker and easier. If you're not, then you have to go a different way. So, I mean, do you have any thoughts about how that actually in practice is going to work?
And it's in the eye of which beholder as well, which is absolutely at the heart of that. And can you become fast track once you've submitted if suddenly somebody thinks you are a beautiful scheme? Can you go from the slow lane to the fast lane, or do you have to apply through that in the first place? It's an interesting concept, and I think, I mean, if I take it seriously for a moment, which we should do and must do, the aspiration to upgrade the environment is a great one, and it really shouldn't be set aside. And if you took something like the building with nature standard, and said, if you met excellent on that in your proposals, you should be fast tracked. And if that was the equation to beauty, for example, then that would be tremendous and would deliver really good outcomes, which were capable of being monitored and delivered as well, because it's a process that you have to demonstrate throughout. And so I could see it being really advantageous on that. And it would be a brave step for a developer. It would take a lot of investment and ambition. So it could be a real motivator for positivity and delivery of extraordinary things.
I agree. I mean, I can see, Jan, us all advising listeners to this webinar, advising their clients about risk control on looking at a project. If what we were dealing here with was with a series of categories, I'm not being too pejorative when I say boxes or to be ticked or tests to be passed, because that's susceptible of a binary analysis, isn't it? But as soon as one goes beyond that, and I mean, this is one of the problems I think with the standardization idea in general, if it's a fabulous building in London, say, but it's 35 or 45 stories high, and can be seen from a World Heritage Site, whatever it may be, where does that leave you in terms of whether it gets on the fast track for beauty? If there are valid objections to its wider impact, for instance. I mean, in the end, you've got to have some sort of evaluative assessment, haven't you?
Absolutely, and I think it will need to do that, and it will be the sensitivity of the environment, because great design doesn't exist in isolation in the planning process. No. It becomes an integrated part of our landscape, our fabric, our communities, our social fabric. And so, it needs to deliver against those things as well. This is why in the presentation I said, to single it out alone risks creating silo development effectively, which isn't well integrated and within both the environment, the setting, and the community.
I agree.
And that's the risk side. Yeah.
I want to thank you, Jan. Talking of silos, one of the other interesting questions I think which is raised that when we were preparing this, I think we knocked around as to whether to speak about this in more detail is what the white paper doesn't say, the areas that it doesn't cover. I mean, Zach, it doesn't cover, does it, data, big logistics, strategic logistics, right, big employment sites, and so on.
That's right.
Really very, very quiet about that, except if you read into growth areas and so on. But what about standalone data centers, for instance?
Well, quite. And actually, even your example, Rupert, in your question to Jan about the tall building in London with views from a World Heritage Site or whatever it might be, raises more issues that aren't really touched on in the white paper, because one of the things that it deals with, but briefly, is a section on heritage. List of Buildings Act is one of the shopping list of items which is up for some reform, we're told, but there's no detail at all on what sort of form that reform might take, and more importantly, how things like the setting of listed buildings and indeed conservation areas are really going to feed into the kind of outline / PIP process and the growth areas and renewal areas that we've been talking about. Really difficult issues, I
Very
think,
difficult.
when you start thinking about the individual, the setting of particular list of buildings, and how different sorts of development might affect that setting in different ways. So it's not the kind of analysis that lends itself to those sorts of binary sort of zonal based procedures. So we'll have to see.
I mean, Richard, just coming back to this point about data and the logistics and big employment, one take on what we could end up getting with the housing numbers is in effect a kind of national housing plan, if you like.
Yeah.
There have been all sorts of gestures, haven't there, through the Commission and so on, toward the National Infrastructure Plan and so on. It's the kind of thing that you would have got, to come back to Zach's question to me earlier on, at the regional level. So if you're looking at allocating housing around the country and you're taking into account constraints, then if you're near the M1, you're going to be taking into account the junction constraints, etc., etc. Should there be, do you think, in order to make this work, would there have to be some sort of national survey of what the infrastructure needs to be provided, where and when?
Yes, I think so. I think that would also be helpful. I think the industrial strategy was obviously designed to do something to that extent, but the survey work and the assessment work hasn't been done. But that could be a good role for National Infrastructure Commission. Then the mayoralties have clearly got an important role here. There is the opportunity, in my view, for the mayoralties to take this forward on a sub-regional basis and be champions of employment land allocation. What zone that falls within? Well, if you look in other countries, and this is another question that somebody raised, you're probably going to need a mixed zone. So you often have, a business zone, a town centre zone, housing zone. And so this growth renewal protected thing isn't that normal in other countries. It's much more normal to allocate types of land, predominant land use. And then you have mixed areas. So you would be able to then mix and match better. You would be able to deal with some of the areas that have a multitudinal array of things. And obviously employment sites, large strategic scale ones would be in the business zone, employment zone, allocation zones, which could be standalone or adjacent to conurbations. So, it's interesting that this is not supposed to be, as I understand it, really a kind of new zonal planning system. This is a basketing of allocations into broad categories. But the trouble with trying to do that is that you lose the precision of multifaceted areas. So maybe you should have a mixed area, if you want to call them areas. So you have the predominant test for the areas, if you want to badge it as a renewal area, predominantly renewal, but could still have some growth or protection, predominantly growth, but could still have renewal or protection. But then a mixed area where there is genuinely a percentage mix.
Yes, I agree. I mean, I think we probably need to draw to a close, but I think I can't resist just putting to you each very briefly one of the questions we've had, which is what percentage of what we see in the white paper do we think we'll actually see in the end? I'm going to go last. So
you always like to go last, Rupert.
Come on.
I will start then on the basis that I would take the classic barrister's answer of 50%, and say that we'll probably see 50% of it come forward. In what time scales? I would say 18 to 24 months for some of it to happen.
Yeah. Zach?
Yeah, no, that sounds very good. That sounds like a very, very, very moderate, reasonable answer from Richard. So I'll associate myself with it.
Jan, I'm going to go with 50 as well, Jan. You're going to be bolder in either direction?
Oh, no, I'm going to be controversial.
Excellent, excellent.
What do you say then?
I would say 60%. And I think we will see elements of it across the board. And so I would go 60%. I think the government is serious about change. I think there's a real intent here. And actually, I think a lot of it we will see by changing guidance. In particular, we're already seeing trailed NPPF. We're already seeing the housing numbers approach change. So I think it will be iterative, But I think we will get elements of this in that iterative process as well as within the legislative change, which is why I go for 60.
No, I think there's something to be said for that, Jan, obviously. And I mean, my over-optimistic, I dare say, view of what we might get is, I mean, with the, this is very heavily housing-led, housing numbers-led. We're going back, as Zach rightly observed, in essence, to the days of New Labour and earlier, with housing targets being identified. Maybe not in quite the same way, but broadly speaking, in that way. Shouldn't there be some opportunity here for some proper consensus across the parties? Because that's the way, it seems to me, that you get a system which might actually have a chance of inhering for longer than an electoral cycle or two. Because let's face it, all the people who are still on this call, certainly the four of us, I know, are fed up, aren't we? I know it's work, in a sense, change, but we're fed up, aren't we, with tinkering, and then the next government tinkers, and indeed the same people, a matter of less than a decade, tinkering in a different direction. And I know that one has to respond to a moving picture, but shouldn't some of the consultation responses, perhaps from some of the industry bodies, rather than commercial interests or so on, be making this point that Marsham Street should be talking to the Labour Party and to the other parties and seeing what they can agree going forward on this.
Yes, I mean, I think Keir Starmer's response obviously was hostile, and that is a concern, particularly in London, isn't it, with Labour Mayor, and we could be in for a bit of a bun fight. And obviously a lot of this mixed type of development we've been talking about is classic London borough territory, when you've got all sorts of constraints as well as opportunities. So I think it would be an excellent idea to do that. I mean, what's very striking about the white paper is that it is very reminiscent of a green paper, isn't it? It's sort of, it reminds me of open source planning in the Tory manifesto, in Cameron's time. And I'm just thinking there's some good stuff here. I mean, there is some good stuff. There is some far more detail and more thought needs to be given to some areas. Let's work on the good stuff and maybe jettison some of the not so good stuff and try and get consensus. I completely agree. I think the chances of that happening are reasonably slim, and I think you have to take a view on who might win the next general election. Difficult to say, but obviously the current majority is strong. So I do think that 18 to 24 months we might get a good set of proposals to move things forward. Obviously the primary legislation and all of the regulations could take beyond that period. So, I mean, one of the things I think I'd be interested in your thoughts are is what should developers and local authorities do now with local plans and applications? I mean, plough on, I would have thought.
I know, I mean, almost certainly plough on, Richard, obviously, because we haven't had time. Again, it's an entire afternoon, I think, to talk about transition. And is this the right time through the middle of 2021 to be doing this kind of thing and getting this underway anyway? But if we are going to do it, how is that transition, the 30 and the 42 months, etc., really going to work? Given, as we know, we've got to have a, 12-month come national, properly, if we're going to do it properly, a national period first, where all these housing numbers and constraints get looked at properly. So I mean, there's a real issue, I think, about the timing and the sensitivity of the economy, etc. at this time. We'd be saying to our clients, won't we, Richard, on most of the projects, just proceed, because we can't play. It's too uncertain to place much weight on the new system at the moment.
Well, there's dangers in waiting, isn't there? Because you don't know what you're going to end up with. So always better to rely on some certainty that you have right now. So I think that's right. I mean, I know, talking to some planning officers, that they think, gosh, this local plan, twice as much work if you're going to go down this level of potential PIP work for the sliding scale in half the amount of time. Obviously you think, well, 2.5 years, you should be able to make real progress on that, but they will need the resources. And everyone always says this, but when's it actually going to happen?
But I think one of the things that, as we look with clients and so on in the period to the end of October, the end of the consultation period, at what is best for them to say, and this is something that I said at the beginning of this webinar, each stakeholder is going to have its own particular concerns and issues, but one of them surely for almost everybody has to be, whatever you end up with, you need to make sure it's going to work for at least 2 electoral cycles, because otherwise all we're buying into here is 2 years of pretty much chaos and transition in the NPPF going round and round with the presumption. So I think that's where we are. And the opportunity, which I think is huge, that we've all identified in various places, needs to be taken in a way that has a stronger platform over a slightly longer period of time. And that's obviously where politics comes in. But anyway, it's 5:45. I'm hugely grateful, not just to my other three speakers. Thank you very much indeed, chaps, but also to those who've helped organise this webinar. I'm very, very grateful, obviously, to all of you who have been listening. And there is obviously a huge amount of work to be done. And Landmark Pinsent Masons obviously very, very interested in understanding from you, if you want to let us know by whatever means you think is appropriate, what specific areas we can spend an hour and a half boring you about, trying to help you with in the next couple of months, because I think we've now, as it were, cleared away some of the surface and we need to drill down into the detail. But many, many thanks indeed to my fellow speakers and to you all for listening. And at this point, we shall draw stumps. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed.